Welcome, everybody, to the Unsprawling podcast, a show for conversations with the folks working hard to improve Calgary's urban fabric. I'm your host, Hazen Elwood, or you can call me Biz, and this is the first episode of a series about housing affordability and zoning reform. So make sure that you stay tuned over the next couple of months while we explore this topic alongside a variety of exciting guests. But today we're joined by Kathryn Davies. She's a homeowner, a distinguished thereminist, a cargo bike evangelist, self-described, and co-founder of a little local pro-housing advocacy organization you might have heard of called More Neighbours Calgary. Kathryn, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Biz. Delighted to be here.
I want to start off today with a couple celebrations. More Neighbours Calgary recently surpassed 400 participants, or you could call 400 neighbors sometimes, we say, on their Discord server. Obviously not everybody is super active, but we do, we had held a snap call after the green line, and I feel like at least 30 people showed up. So it's really something when you have lots of people in a space that it becomes so much more lively. I feel like 400 is really such an incredible achievement for an organization that's barely over a year old. What's your perspective on the sort of rate of growth that More Neighbours has been seeing?
Oh, it's been fun to watch it grow. It's certainly slowed down a little bit since the rezoning for housing, but we do have people who keep popping in. It is a lively Discord server. There's a lot of really interesting conversation happening. Some of it is, occasionally it gets a little bit inane, but often it really cuts to the heart of a lot of the issues that we are trying to solve here. So it's really a delight to be a participant there.
I seem to remember getting in the weeds yesterday on in the memes channel, having a nice epistemological, philosophical discussion on the role of architecture and urban design and urban planning.
Mm-hmm.
That was quite good. If you're tuning in a few days from the release of this podcast, sing a little happy birthday to yourself, because we are 1 year out from the start of the housing strategy public hearing, where the city of Calgary finally approved their ambitious action plan to increase housing availability in the city of Calgary. Of course, the housing strategy has quite some historic significance for More Neighbours Calgary. For folks who might not know where More Neighbours Calgary originated from, would you like to give people a bit of a spiel?
Yeah, sure. And it's hard to believe that it's been a year since the housing strategy public hearing. That seems like a lifetime ago. So for those that are not familiar with the housing strategy or the housing affordability task force, so Calgary has always been an affordable city compared to, say, Toronto or Vancouver. And over the last few years, we've started to see house prices and rental rates tick up in a kind of an alarming way. And so we're losing that affordability advantage. And in what year are we in now? So in 2022, so 2 years ago, the city convened a housing affordability task force. So they convened a panel of experts to look at what's going on in Calgary and to say, well, what can we do about this problem of housing affordability? And so this expert panel took a year, and they came back with a report that contained 33 recommendations. And the report went to council. I remember it was June 6th of 2023, a day that will live in infamy. And council said, no thanks. And they rejected the report. And they didn't reject the full implementation of the report. They just said, we're not going to touch these recommendations, primarily because one of the recommendations was to look at citywide, a very moderate citywide upzoning, which is something that we've talked a lot about over the last year. And I know from personal experience that zoning politics, neighborhood change politics can be very fraught. And I think a lot of councillors looked at that and were like, politically, we're just not going to touch that. And they didn't want to face the backlash. And it was a bit of a political miscalculation because while, yes, there are a lot of people who get feisty when it comes to neighborhood change, there are also a lot of people in Calgary who are deeply concerned about the state of our housing system, the rise in costs, the fact that our homeless population is increasing dramatically, And the fact that, everybody knows someone who's struggling to find housing, and it's, seeping into the middle class or whatever. So a lot of there was a backlash to this rejection of the Housing Affordability Task Force. And I still remember just how angry I was that day, like just how disappointed I was with City Council that they couldn't even take this report and say, okay, we're going to try to do something about this. And I wasn't the only one. There were a few of us who were in a group chat, and one of those people was Willem Klumpenhauer. And Willem had been living in Toronto. And there's a really active group in Toronto called More Neighbours Toronto. And so he posted in this chat, we need More Neighbours Calgary. And I said, yes, we need More Neighbours Calgary. We need it right now. So on the spur of the moment, we basically put together a Twitter account and a Discord server, and More Neighbours was born. And the concept is very simple, insofar that there is a lot of opposition to neighborhood change when it comes to building housing or building different types of housing. There's also a lot of support for this kind of activity, and yet the voices of support are never actually heard at council meetings, or they don't flood councillors' inboxes. And we said, well, we need to harness some of the energy in support of this and show people that it's important to speak up in favor of housing. And so that's what we've done over the last year and a bit.
Totally. And it's such incredible work, and it's absolutely after my heart. I say it very often. It's very easy to organize fear or hatred. And this is of course a force across politics globally at the moment. But I think especially in Calgary, there's this cynical attitude towards things where let me try to backseat or armchair criticize every possible little thing without actually engaging with the issue, learning about it, figuring it out. And of course, never when something good happens, being positive about it, like actually coming out and trying to be positive or create positive change. And so it's very, very, and the only way we can change that is by doing it. Right. These things don't happen unless we believe that they should happen, and then we enact them. And so absolutely so excited to hear that there is more and more positive action politics happening in the city every day. You touched on the group chat there. You don't have to go into super detail about who's there or anything. I'm not, but it's important to recognize that these things don't happen in vacuums. Usually along social networks that are already in place get these things started. And so I put in my notes that the housing strategy was obviously the spark, and for me it definitely was too. I wasn't nearly as engaged in municipal politics until I heard that my top issue was starting to be toyed with. But what was some of the fuel that had been, I guess, puddling on the ground for a little bit? What do you remember? What the first thing was for you that got you engaged in municipal politics?
Oh, yes, I do. But actually, speaking of that group chat, that was a very informal group, but that dates back to the Guidebook for Great Communities. That it was an event at City Hall in, I believe, March of 2021, which is a while ago now. There was a very innocuous document that came to council in 2021. It was designed to sort of guide the local area planning process, which some of the listeners may or may not be familiar with. And it was, it was a technical document, a planning document, but there was one section, again, that talked about combining single detached homes with duplexes and row houses. And that it lit a fire a metaphorical fire in some neighborhoods. And it just caused this intense reaction to, like I said, this very innocuous planning document. So there was a 3-day public hearing when Calgarian after Calgarian called in to this meeting to say, we need to protect the single detached character of our neighborhoods. We need to protect the single family nature of our character of our neighborhoods. And I just could not believe the reaction to this. So I talk about More Neighbours as a pro-housing movement. That public hearing was such a great example of the fact that there is a lot of, for lack of a better term, anti-housing sentiment in Calgary. People did not want any other type of or form of housing in their neighborhood. And it it was kind of a turning point for me when there were two things. So I realized like, this is a serious problem, that these are the voices that are dominating the discourse at City Hall. It was, a small group, but they're very, very vocal, and they did a really good job of organizing to oppose this guidebook for great communities. And the other thing I realized, though, mostly just following it on Twitter, is that I wasn't alone in seeing this as a problem. And I managed to connect with a few other people who were upset, frankly, by the way that document played out. And so we started just chatting semi-regularly. It was very informal, but we just kept in touch on some of these municipal issues that we care about. And so when the housing strategy or the housing affordability task force blew up in June of 2022, there was a bit of a foundation there. There was some expertise and some community that we could draw from. And that was the foundation of what is now More Neighbours Calgary. So for my origin story, there are a few things. I took some climate-related courses in my master's degree, and at some point through that, I was like, oh, if we actually want to reduce our carbon emissions, we're going to have to drive a bit less, and we need to change the way we build housing. Like we need to share walls, essentially. And it hit home that we design our cities in a way that is really, really inefficient for climate reasons, for fiscal sustainability reasons, just for social reasons as well. Like I live in a very walkable neighborhood, and I'm actually, it's very unique in Calgary that I'm able to interact with my neighbors on the street, essentially.
2 train stations.
We have 2 train stations in our neighborhood. Yeah, we're very lucky. And a lot of amenities that we can walk to. So I just, and I've lived abroad. I lived in Germany for a while. I've lived in the UK briefly, and it's amazing to live in a slightly higher density neighborhood. I mean, there are some trade-offs for sure, but the benefits are amazing. Like just having a more functional transit system, being able to walk to amenities, being able to live close to the places you go. And so just over several years, I've come to believe that we could do a better job of designing our cities. We could make different choices, different policy choices that would lead to us being a more climate-friendly city, a more fiscally sustainable city, a healthier and happier city. And yet we keep shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes time to make those decisions. And we keep defaulting to the status quo. And I just think the status quo isn't really working that well for us. And I think other cities are starting to come to terms with that as well. And so hopefully we can continue to harness the momentum behind just making incremental change and just doing a little bit better in our city.
Totally. I think, and that's definitely one of the things that made zoning reform the biggest issue for me, at least in the last year, is just that idea of looking at what's considered normal in our city, using the statistic sense of the word, in that over 60% of our residential land is single detached only. And that's not like a descriptive measure of that's just what so happens to be there because people want it to be. That's like a prescriptive measure of that's all that can go there legally, or we'll come take your house down. And so, well, I actually have no idea what would go down. You probably just get like a stop work order. But you look at anywhere else in the world, and there's still, of course, single detached neighborhoods. There's still places that look actually quite similar to ours. But in many scenarios, these are places that are not thought of as normal or permanent, in that those are places that will always remain like that. I would say look at like a suburban city in even the UK, which is not known for being quite fanciful in some of the newer built districts in the UK. And we were looking at Street View. There was some business that only had like 5 parking stalls in for the business, and the streets tended to be like half the width they are. Like local roads would usually be 1.5 lanes, and collectors would still only be like 2. And even those choices on top of zoning reform, things like that, where we understand that these communities will grow and change. And so we don't want to build ourselves into a hole with the way that we design the whole community. That's really what starts to create some of move the needle on some of those things. I think it's interesting you said that some of these connections obviously go back to the guidebook for great communities, and the connections that you've made in your own neighborhood. RCG first went into the land use bylaw back in 2014, so that's a full 7 years before the guidebook for great communities. And I know that immediately after that, I think when it had come to the Planning Commission for review, then Commissioner Jody Gondek put forward the motion to say, hey, should we test this out, like, before we just let this thing onto the land use bylaw and let it into the wild? Because the issue was that the previous land uses that were kind of supposed to do what RCG was doing just weren't really catching on. They weren't very popular, or they weren't, it wasn't quite working. And so she said, like, should we test this out and see how it works, and then maybe we can use that data to make sure that this actually works going forward. And so what's interesting is they chose Banff Trail for that. I think maybe Banff Trail and Capitol Hill. And do you remember what the response was in your community when that decision came down, that Banff Trail is going to be used as a bit of a pilot project for this new land use?
So Banff Trail, it is kind of a pilot project for RCG. So our neighborhood was part of what was then called an area redevelopment plan. So we had an ARP from the 80s, and they did an update to that. And that update coincided with the introduction of the RCG land use district. And so if you're not familiar with RCG, it stands for residential, contextual, ground oriented. And so the most common example is these cute townhouses. You'll see 4 row houses on a corner in some of the inner city neighborhoods. So I was actually on the consultation committee for this ARP update, and this would have been about 10 to 12 years ago, I think. And so we discussed some places in the neighborhood that might be appropriate for RCG, and the city actually did some proactive rezoning. So a good chunk of my neighborhood is zoned RCG. So yes, in around 2014, we had an area redevelopment plan update that included a number of parcels that were zoned RCG. And it's really been interesting to watch the evolution of my neighborhood following that. So I think initially there was some pushback. Some people were concerned about things like parking or shadowing or whatever. And I think there are still maybe a few people in the neighborhood who don't like it, and that's fine. Not everyone has to like everything. But my experience has been that there's been sort of a gentle, gradual, very light intensification. And it really only happens when properties are sold. A lot of the bungalows in this neighborhood are nearing the end of their life cycle. They're in rough shape. And so it's actually nice to see something new and fresh go up. I live close to one of the larger projects that was featured in a lot of the city's communication on RCG. And it's 13 row houses over 3 lots with basement suites as well. And it's actually it's a really nice looking, it's a cute project. Really nice people live there. It hasn't caused a parking catastrophe or anything. And I think that Banff Trail is actually a really good example of how this works, like how we're just making room for more people in the neighborhood. It is a really ideally located neighborhood for a lot of people. We're making a room for different household shapes and sizes and people to get into the neighborhood at different price points. There are some are for sale, some are for rent. So it just has created a diversity of housing to suit diverse needs.
Yeah, I definitely recommend that people go watch the old Sprawlcast episode. I guess it's only 2 years old, so it's not that old, but called The Battle of Banff Trail, where Jeremy and Kathryn talk about board games and swords, and also the neighborhood, the pathways that a neighborhood can choose to go on, where either you get kind of this restrictive land use situation that always results in stagnation or exclusion, right? Because when redevelopment does happen, it really happens where it's you had said you have these old, essentially broken down bungalows that end up turning into the gigantic mansions, and we see that in so many neighborhoods across Calgary. Talk a little bit about the real opportunity that comes with the rejuvenation of a community.
So yeah, rejuvenation, that's an interesting point. And so if you do listen to this broadcast, it's about a legal battle that took place. I think it's mostly wound down now over a restrictive covenant. And restrictive covenants are maybe a topic for a different sprawlcast. I won't go into too much detail. But there is a section of the neighborhood that is under a restrictive covenant that unfortunately has prevented, it really limits what can be built. So the city says you can build up to this standard, but the restrictive covenant says no, you're limited to either a single dwelling or 2 dwellings per lot. And it's very difficult. It is possible, but very difficult to have that covenant removed. So all that to say, you can see a big difference in my neighborhood in the areas that are covenanted and the areas that are not covenanted. So under the covenanted area, I think a lot of homeowners are perhaps waiting for the covenant issue to resolve, but the homes are not being invested in. Some of them are not being maintained, and it's just kind of a dead zone in terms of redevelopment. There are a few infill duplexes, but particularly right next to the Banff Trail C train station, there's just a sense of stasis, like while we wait for the covenant to be resolved so that we can actually build some decent transit-oriented housing. And so it's interesting to look at that difference. Like the area that is not covenanted is flourishing. It's growing, people are arriving, it's thriving, and the area that is under covenanted is just a little more stagnant.
Totally. And it's a very similar case in my neighborhood, not for any particularly restrictive reasons, but just kind of by virtue of being somewhere that's a little bit less. Well, actually, no. What's interesting is we have a bit of a restrictive covenant that the Alberta government puts on us through the Airport Vicinity Protection Act, which is extra fascinating. I think that makes developers a little bit scared to develop here because they're like, this is a really horribly written like provincial level land use bylaw that I have no idea what to do with, and so people are like, I'm just gonna go develop in Renfrew instead. And it's fascinating that we have these mostly original built homes in the 1960s that in some cases have been very well maintained. If somebody has the incredible amount of gumption to be able to keep these things up. But a lot of the time people, they really just want to view this as a shelter. And so they don't really worry about that part of it so much. And so the neighborhood really has this sense of rotting in place and not really getting the private development that it deserves, and of course not getting the public investment that it deserves as a result. Whereas in the case of somewhere like Banff Trail, it becomes really, really obvious with all this pent-up demand living next to train stations that the house isn't even what is expensive there. It's the land. It's the fact that you live next to a train station. That's not a choice that a private property owner gets to make. And so if they're able to develop something more on that land, they just lucked out incredibly hard by virtue of something that was kind of out of their control. And so rezoning in a lot of ways is such a superpower for a landowner or a homeowner to have is the ability to actually make the most out of this plot of land that you own. Talk a little bit about that. I guess misunderstanding that some people have. I hear people, they talk about, property values, like it's just an insane debate. Like almost a dialectical, if you have any thoughts on the matter.
Oh, I have many thoughts on the matter. So I'm not a professional economist, but I have some economics training, and there is a relationship between scarcity and price. Like there is a relationship between scarcity and price, and we see that with scarce land. So land is becoming scarce in Calgary. I mean, as your podcast title suggests, we can't keep sprawling indefinitely, and we need to start making better use of the land that we have. Going back to what I was saying about the dichotomy between the covenanted and the uncovenanted area in Banff Trail, the prices in the covenanted area are severely depressed because you can't do very much with that land. You're artificially curtailing the potential of that land. Whereas the uncovenanted areas, the prices have gone up dramatically because we're one of the few neighborhoods, or I guess until this past summer, we were one of the few neighborhoods where you could actually build something other than a single detached home. And there is huge demand for that because so many people just cannot afford a single detached home. So many people don't need a single detached home. So many people don't want the maintenance associated with a single detached home. So there's demand for diversity of housing. We're seeing that in the places where you can build something other than a single detached home, the prices go up because those parcels are scarce. And I think that was one of the important things about the rezoning for housing debate. And one thing that was maybe missed by a lot of the commentators on that is that, yes, we've seen prices spike in areas where RCG is permitted, but that is because there are so few of those areas. If you make it permissible across the entire city, that levels the playing field and should presumably bring down prices in a neighborhood like Banff Trail, because suddenly you can build that same type of housing close to other C train stations or close to other amenities. And I guess we'll see how that plays out over the next year, or a few years, I suppose. But
yes, and that was one of the things that I think was one of those concepts that wasn't quite clicking for people, and it's something I've heard from Jean Colacroix in the redevelopment of Bridgeland is a lot of the community members are like, well, we're not opposed to this, but we want to at least have some kind of insurance that other communities are going to do the same, because if we upzone our property, of course that's going to like drastically spike not only our prices that we're paying for this, but just the demand for redevelopment there is going to be so artificially squeezed into such a small area that it's like we're going to reach a level of community change over time that does feel unsustainable, that doesn't feel incremental. And that was one of the big pushes for us, is that with RCG as such a flexible land use that's supposed to grow over time, if you want that benefit to really be concentrated in many, many, many hands across the entire city, actually be something that benefits the public as a whole, those landowners that could actually make gains on that rezoning. You don't want to concentrate it into these really speculative, hard to navigate. Oh, what zoning is my property again? No, I have to look at the city website, and it's RCG X. What does that mean? And so it was really simplifying our land use bylaw can be a little bit scary because we have all this context of what it looks like to have a restrictive one. We think it's going to be more of those deficits translating over, but it's actually solving that problem. And I think that doesn't quite click for people. I got into property prices a little bit. We've heard people say that redevelopment's going to make home prices way more unaffordable, and then turn around and say it's going to make property values free fall. They'll say developers are only looking to build the most luxury, most grandiose condos you've ever seen, and then say that they're cardboard boxes with the corners cut off. Why do you think that people are having such a difficult time reconciling some of the different information about rezoning and redevelopment? Do you think it's just a lack of this information being made and communicated publicly, or do you think there's something a bit more pernicious going on?
I think it is fair to call it pernicious to some degree. So I think the paradoxes that you outlined I heard a lot of those through the debate. And it's like Schrodinger's row house. It's all things to all people. It's luxury housing. It's going to bring the riffraff to the neighborhood. There wasn't a lot of consistency in those arguments. I think if we really step back a bit, the people who were very upset about RCG, and I mean, it's a small percentage of Calgarians. Like, we heard from 600 plus people at this hearing out of a city of 1.5 million. Like, it's a very, very small number of people who are engaged in this debate. And I think there's a certain subset of the population who is very uncomfortable with the idea of their built environment changing. And I can respect that. I can understand that. I can sympathize with that. But then I think also, if you listen to this discourse for long enough, for starters, sometimes the quiet part is said out loud. There are overtly racist things said, and more commonly overtly classist things said. So people don't want the wrong kind of people living close to them, and often they use a shortcut of renters as being the wrong kind of people. So, I mean, I don't think this is an issue that's going away. I think there will always be people who are resistant to change, and there will always be a status quo bias, and that's something that we'll have to contend with forever. Like, that's just part of human nature. But I think like the discourse around this this zoning change, it was not rational. It was not rooted in fact. It was rooted in emotion. And so we had that, for that reason, we had these weird justifications come out, like, you know, making like allowing the market to respond to market demand was suddenly some form of socialism or communism, which was the most bewildering one to me. So, I mean, we could talk about the actual facts at hand, and we could dissect those, but I don't think that's really the issue. I think the issue is more just that people wanted to oppose this, and so they grabbed onto any excuse that they could find, and that's why we had so many very, very strange comments during the rezoning for housing debate.
Yeah, I think what you said is not rational. This is kind of a hallmark of very irrational decision making. Is kind of these paradoxes we said, where you hold this belief very, very dearly, and you will rationalize it, even if the ways to rationalize it end up leading you to totally separate and irreconcilable conclusions, because you're not really worried about those things being true or being kind of connected. But as long as they are bad, and then you can point at them and say, look, this thing is bad, then you can kind of defend yourself from having to deal with the ego death of maybe you might be wrong. But I do think that there are a lot of very, very valid concerns that people were having during this, just maybe pointing their fingers at the wrong culprit. I like to say that we urban activists or advocates, both, I like saying both sometimes, and the people who are opposing this change tooth and nail with the pitchforks and flames out, we kind of have the same enemy, which is this very, very fragile version of city building that Calgary has locked itself into, where you genuinely have some kind of fear in your heart when there's like a 4-house development around the corner instead of a 1-house development around the corner. I think that speaks to the level of, like I was saying, permanence earlier. Is we've kind of built our cities in a way that's so inflexible that we haven't even imagined what might happen if we start to change our built environment. And people bring up the parking and the trash collection and traffic and all of these things that have really, really clear solutions to them. Just things that they might not quite have on their radar yet is how we implement some of those things. I think one of the best things I like to remember about RCG is just how incremental it is. By design is something that is supposed to grow alongside the community without really changing the community itself too much. I think people, they have this interpretation that as redevelopment happens, my neighborhood is just going to become a dump of cars. It's just going to become horrible. Does that seem to translate to reality in your experience?
So that is a really, really interesting question. And so I will disclose that I own a car and that I sometimes drive, but my rate of driving is probably much lower than that of most Calgarians. And I feel like this is something that uniquely Calgarian. In this city, we get around by car. Like, everyone gets around by car, except that actually not everyone does. And we often forget that automobile, like the private automobile, is not a feasible mode of transportation for everyone, sometimes for health reasons, sometimes for economic reasons. And so we've got these blinders on, or these car tinted glasses sometimes, and a lot of people cannot fathom the idea of transportation mode shift. So going back to what I said earlier about how, you know, I was in this master's program and we were talking about climate policy, and it occurred to me that it would be good for many reasons if people drove less. And I'm not declaring war on cars. I'm not saying you can't drive anywhere. I'm just saying that my kids walk to school. I walk to the grocery store, and it's really nice to just not be in my car so much. So I think that really colors the debate. A lot of people just don't get anywhere in the city except by car. But I live in, like I said, a really walkable neighborhood close to a lot of amenities. A lot of my neighbors own only one or sometimes no vehicle. We've got a great cycling community here. Like I said, our kids can walk to school. And I think, if you poll people in the abstract about what they want in their city, everyone wants to live in a walkable neighborhood where you can walk to your local coffee shop, you can walk to the corner store. And when we go traveling, we go to places like Paris or Amsterdam where that is a reality. You can walk to amenities, you can enjoy the public realm. And in reality, this is what we're trying to do in the city. We're just trying to make it a little bit more walkable. We're trying to make things more accessible. We're trying to let people live closer together and closer to things. And I've seen in my own neighborhood that kind of, when you have that opportunity, you just naturally get out of your car and you get on your bike or you put on your shoes and go. And it's really nice. It's very desirable, and it doesn't. Yeah. So I would say that to your question, building more housing, it does not correlate with more traffic necessarily. And it's kind of a frustrating argument that we had to contend with a lot through this whole debate.
And I think this is not, I haven't done the meta-analysis on this, and of course there are outliers, but qualitatively, a lot of the neighborhoods I think that have produced the most rancorous debate on the rezoning issue are a lot of these very amenity-rich neighborhoods that I find it very difficult to believe that they would deal with any sort of increase in traffic. I think of places like a Hillhurst or a Elbow Park or a Briar Hill. These places that are fine. Like, they could totally deal with a couple apartment buildings in there. People would walk around because those places have the amenities to walk around. And I find it a little bit more compelling in a place like maybe a Bonavista or like a Shawnee Evergreen, where they or especially a lot of Ward 5. I know that was a big issue for Rod Shullywell to hop onto this debate, was the fear that this would create a genuine parking conflict with people up there. But again, I think that we're talking about kind of a proxy issue where you're not really taking issue with this so much as the negative consequences that this might have as a result of bad city building. And so it goes to show that this isn't far enough. And I think it goes to show that we need to continue to defend this and continue to let people know that this isn't enough. Like, we need this and we need to keep going further. We had a podcast about a month ago now talking about that people had voted and taken away the pedestrian zone in Banff because of the traffic that it was allegedly causing. I don't know how people walking causes cars. But, there's the confounder there that cars not being able to travel through one area causes cars to travel through another area. And I think it's important that we have to communicate that we really need to keep pushing on so many different issues at once. And I think that reflects in the way that the rezoning for housing debate went down. Talk a little bit about the collaboration between so many different interests in the city of Calgary to come together on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most fun things about the whole experience. So More Neighbours is housing focused, but urban design touches every aspect of our lives. And so we saw a lot of alliances between us and people who care about our transit system. I mean, there's basically a perfect overlap between housing and transit advocacy, I've found, particularly in this city, but also people who care about like societal well-being. So social services organizations, particularly that deal with housing, were very supportive of this rezoning project. And it was one of those situations where people from all different policy arenas, all different policy specialties were aligned on this issue. Like, yes, this is very important. And it was great to be in a room regularly with a lot of these different people, see those different perspectives, and try to move forward together.
Absolutely. It was so great to have to really attack this in a way that felt very cohesive, with many different people who are all coming to the same conclusion. And I think you don't see that unless you're fighting towards positive change. There's this Oh the Urbanity video that came out a little while ago about people opposing bike lanes, and it's this real hodgepodge of totally different interests who are all saying totally different things. But because I hate bike lanes, or I hate this specific bike lane, you don't need to have like an actual opinion on something to come and poke people with a pitchfork. And so I think it's a lot more challenging to get involved in a very positive and a very I would say pragmatic version of politics, but I think it definitely, it's a lot more effective. And I think it makes people listen, who the powers that be listen a lot more effectively. Of course, rezoning for housing has passed, which is fantastic. But I've seen statistics that show that it only covers maybe 3% of our housing deficit, like the expected number of housing units we're going to have to provide. It's something like an extra 750 per year was the city's estimate on what rezoning for housing could be attributable for, which is not nearly enough. I should say that we have actually had in the news, rentals are starting to drop just a little bit in Calgary because of our increase in housing production. But what do you think is kind of the next biggest thing that housing advocates should be looking at?
So I think going forward, More Neighbours will focus on maybe more project by project, I think. So there are some big ones that are coming up this year. I think the biggest one is probably Glenmore Landing, which I think is a really good and really important project. It could create a lot of housing on a BRT line and in a really nice place that people would like to live, with lots of amenities. You know, it's very walkable. It's right on the bike path. There's also the Viscount Bennett site that has generated a lot of controversy. And I cannot imagine a less controversial place to build housing. So I'm looking forward to supporting both of those. And then I mentioned the local area planning process earlier. There are some really interesting local area planning exercises underway. I think it raises a lot of questions about engagement. Who do we engage? How do we engage? Could we do a better job of engaging a broader segment of the population in these plans? And if any of the engaged team are listening, I think you're doing a great job. This is not meant as a criticism of you. It's just more of an insight into the process. So we will do our best to engage on those. And then, there was a public hearing meeting of council last week, and I wasn't able to listen to most of it, but just trying to be engaged in little projects. Like, there were a couple of projects that came up for rezoning at this council meeting. They were very small, again, very innocuous, and yet just the controversy, the resistance that they generated was, it was mind-boggling to me. So there is always going to be a need for pro-housing voices on projects that are large, projects that are small, and we'll try to make our voices heard where we can.
Yeah, I think that public hearing saw an 8-unit, or I guess I should say 8-dwelling development in Brentwood, right next to the train station. And there's so many of these situations where I think, if this isn't the place to do it, then where is? Like, what the hell are we talking about when, but what if somebody next door has a problem with it? Like, what are we talking about? There's actually development happening very close to me in my neighborhood. We have started to see just a little bit of pressure kind of leaking over from Renfrew, which is exciting to see, is this, and it didn't require rezoning. A lot of my community is RC2, and so you can actually get up to 6 dwellings out of that. And so it's the 6 dwelling proposal that's just a block away from a grocery store, less than a minute walk away from a bus stop that takes you directly to SAIT and the university. You got a 7-Eleven. We got a few restaurants up in that central business district in our community. Like it's a wonderful place. And one of the things I said to the development committee director for my community association, because she's quite, I would say she's quite pro-development. She understands we really do have places in our community that really deserve the more attention than they're currently getting, that could create our community into a more vibrant and sustainable place. But of course, she has the email address that gets all of those wacky letters from people who want to throw their 2 cents into the mix every single day. And one of the things I said is, like, we're talking about the perfect place for this kind of development, and the 6 households that make their life there are going to love that, and the fact that house is there way, 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 way more than anybody could possibly imagine hating it. Like, there's just no way. This kind of strange affixation with the ways that other people live their lives just totally disappears the second you see somebody else actually having a great time. How have you seen the tide shift in your neighborhood, a little bit more on the micro level, with these people who are coming in and actually live in these redevelopments? How do they feel about all this stuff?
That's a great question. So I do know some people who are living in RCG housing, and they love it, and they are thrilled to have a place to live. And they make great neighbors. There's one development. It's not far from me. It's rental housing, and they permit pets. And if you've ever looked for rental housing with an animal, it can be really challenging. And so we've got all these people out walking their dogs in the morning. They say hi. It's nice to have eyes on the street. So as far as the broader neighborhood, these letters of opposition, or these emails of opposition, they always look at the worst case scenario. Well, like, maybe this housing development will bring crime, and it will bring congestion, and it will bring bad weather forever or something. But then the housing gets built, and the sky doesn't fall, and we kind of move on with our lives and forget that it was ever controversial. And I think we've seen that. So we have a lot of RCG row houses on corner lots in my neighborhood, and they're great. And our neighborhood has not been ruined. If anything, it has been enhanced. And so I think that's just how the pattern goes. So you have this opposition based on the worst case scenario. The project goes ahead. The worst case scenario does not happen, and we all move on with our lives.
I think a lot of people I've seen in our circles, when they come, they're so eager to. They have this vision for a better city, and they're so eager to do anything to move it even a little bit further towards that. But I think a lot of people who understand the complexity of the issues that we're dealing with maybe don't feel so inclined to put their perspective out there. Maybe they feel a little bit self-conscious, like, oh, who am I? Like, I'm not an economist. I'm not a developer. I have no idea how these things actually work. And so it becomes difficult for people to take that leap of confidence to put their positive vision out there. What are some of the things that you've been saying to people to get them activated to the next level, where they actually want to show up and come to some of these debates and put a positive message out there?
So I'll refer back to the Guidebook for Great Communities public hearing that went on for 3 days, which now, after having sat through the rezoning for housing hearing, it seems so quaint.
For almost 3 weeks.
Yeah. So so Guidebook for Great Communities, that was the first time I had ever spoken at council. I had never spoken up about anything publicly like that before. And I was trading messages with someone else who was also following this on Twitter, and he was like, "What's going on here?" And so we talked a bit about it, and he said, "Oh, are you going to speak?" And I found the screenshot of the Facebook Messenger conversation that we had. And I was like, I don't know, maybe I should call in. And he was like, maybe I will as well. And so we both ended up calling in to support the Guidebook for Great Communities. And then I have this message from him afterward, and he said, Thanks for encouraging me to speak up. I was really nervous, but it was exhilarating, and it felt so good to try and be involved in positive change. And he said, now I want to speak at council all the time. And now he does speak at council all the time. And I speak at council all the time. And so one of the things that was great about the Rezoning for Housing hearing is that we had this big opportunity, this big need for people to speak up in support of housing. And so there was a community of people who had never done this before, but we all kind of jumped in together, and we did training on like how to fill out the form to speak at council. And we did like a practice session on like how to put together your remarks. And it's not particularly complicated. I mean, the filling of the form is very complicated, but putting together some thoughts on supporting housing and saying we need more housing in this city, we need different types of housing in the city, and just encouraging people to tell their own stories was really powerful. And I think the feedback was great. A lot of people just felt so good about speaking up on this issue, getting their feelings off their chest and making their voices heard. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I watched almost the entire 3-week hearing, and there were some very, very powerful presentations made by, people who are not professionals, they're not economists, they're not developers, they're just citizens who were speaking from the heart. And I think for a lot of people, it was a really good experience. And hopefully those people are equipped to continue to speak up on civic issues going forward.
Absolutely. I think, and that's really good, that the tell your story is definitely one of my favorite messages to let people as an insight to let people into municipal engagement is, I think, especially very intelligent people are always looking at what they don't know and how they can get that information. It's always like, you want to learn more and you want to research and you really want to develop a more well-rounded view of the world. But if you're that type of person, you're probably discounting all of the things that you already know and all of the things that are very core to you that you might not really see as incredibly important to the topic of conversation. But once you really look and you say, what am I excited about? Why did I join this Discord server? Like, why was this something that activated me? And if you can just tell that story, I think that tends to be the most compelling thing. Like some of the most compelling arguments that I've heard just come out of restating a lot of those things that people already know and are very familiar with. Just in telling our political representatives that there is a broadening and deepening political will for this kind of change. For a multitude of different reasons, for a multitude of different people. I want to talk a little bit about, you touched on briefly some of the things that More Neighbours does to organize ahead of these things. And I know that's one thing that's really been great to see over the last couple of weeks in the More Neighbours Discord is that now that rezoning has come to pass and we've had a bit of a summer to decompress, there's really been a bit of a second wind. We're getting people together and we're building these actually quite large chat rooms and calls of people who are excited to continue moving. What are some of the things that are on the agenda for More Neighbours over the next couple of months in terms of what people are actually doing to bring people together?
So yes, there has been a bit of a lull over the summer. I think a lot of people needed a bit of a break, myself included. One thing that has been nice about this whole experience is that we have built a bit of a social community, and a lot of it happens online, but we have had some really great in-person events. And, I've made friends through this. A lot of relationships have been formed. So I would like to keep building that and maintaining that. we've had a couple of really cool events. We did some smaller events that were more, I guess, education and discussion focused. We had a great event at the library with Oh the Urbanity, which I think was your brilliant idea, Biz. So congratulations again on that.
That was my Instagram DM.
Yeah. So I would love to have more events, just bringing people together in person. You can only go so far on Discord. And actually, I would love to bring in some guest speakers from other cities, maybe from within the city as well. So stay tuned. So just for anyone who's wondering, how does More Neighbours do these things? We operate on a budget of basically zero. So things happen when they happen. It's all volunteer based. I'm thinking about looking for a little bit of funding to do some of these larger events, but More Neighbours runs completely on volunteer power. So things happen when they happen. But we do have some things in the works. If you are listening and you have any great ideas for some things that you would like to see from More Neighbours, just drop into our Discord server and let someone know, or shoot me an email.
Absolutely. Hop on to moreneighbours.ca to check out their website and get informed that way. Or another thing is that we do really want to, when other organizations have events, host those on our big event calendar, because sometimes it's difficult to hear about those things, and not every organization has the social media capacity to really market these things, and so it could be difficult to know what's going on. So check out the community.unsprawling.org, our Unsprawling forum calendar, where we'll absolutely make sure that the More Neighbours stuff is communicated on there as well. Very, very exciting time for housing advocacy in Calgary. I know there's a lot of different opinions that people are having after it feels we've kind of got over one big hurdle where it was easy to focus on, and now there's kind of many different opinions. But I think everybody still is at that place where they know how to focus together and come towards something when something important is about to happen. And so I'm excited to see what happens over the next couple of months. Do you have any closing thoughts for people?
Oh, just one clarification. Our website is moreneighbourscalgary.ca. If you go to moreneighbours.ca, yeah, that'll take you to the More Neighbours Toronto site, which is a very worthy website. They've got lots of great information there. And we must acknowledge that we borrowed a lot from More Neighbours Toronto. They've done great work.
Absolutely. This stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum, and a lot of it is building on top of things that already occur. And so if you've got the next great idea, absolutely get in contact with the Unsprawling folks, and we'll try to match you with the people who are already working in those realms. And that makes it so much easier once you have some of those connections to really create positive change. And so we're so happy that you tuned in to talk about housing affordability and availability, and of course we're so happy that a lot of these efforts are really starting to pay off, and we've got so much work left to do. But this is such an exciting way to really turn our communities into a more sustainable place. And so we hope you come back next time to talk more about zoning reform and the ways that it can change our city with the next guest on our radar.
Thanks so much, Biz. I really enjoyed this conversation.